Welcome to The Jewish Lens, a podcast to discuss anything and everything from a Jewish perspective. Now, please help me welcome the man who controls the media, your host, Jonathan Rosen.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of The Jewish Lens. I'm Jonathan Rosen, and today I am thrilled to welcome a pop culture historian whose work has been featured in such places as CNN, the New York Daily News, and IGN. He's the author of the fun book, Is Superman Circumcised? The Complete Jewish History of the World's Greatest Hero. And he co-wrote and produced the documentary Jewce, the Jewish Comic Experience. Please help me welcome Roy Schwartz. Roy, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we have a lot to cover, but I always like to start off by going back. You were born in Israel, so were you from an observant family? What was your upbringing like?
No, I came from a pretty secular family. I was born and raised in Tel Aviv, but when you were born in Israel, you were really saturated in Jewish culture. In the United States, what makes you Jewish, aside from your birthright, you have to go to Jewish places, be with Jewish people, do Jewish things. In Israel, you put on your flip-flops and you go down to buy ice cream. It's statistically 80% chance it's two Jews, interacting.
Which is what I love about there, by the way. Yes.
Right. And when you know Hebrew, you can read the texts and engage with them a lot more. And I also studied in school. I can speak Aramaic in a very rudimentary way. So you can understand what you're reading, whether it's the Bible or the Talmud or any kind of Chazal writings, etc. Mm-hmm. And Israeli culture in general is steeped not necessarily religiously, just culturally, in Judaism and Jewishness. You step on a bus and there's a quote from the Bible, "Mipnei seva takum," which basically translates as, if somebody has white hair, you stand up for them. And that's a biblical quote, and it's just there on the buses and stickers. So you just grow up in it, and it makes you it makes your Jewish identity a lot more baked in.
My daughter's there now studying for the year, so she's loving it. I'm hoping she comes back.
Which city is she?
She's in Jerusalem. She's in Jerusalem for the year. She's in seminary, so she's loving life there. So you and I have something very much in common, which I was fascinated by this. You learned English from reading comic books, I saw. So first of all, which were some of your favorites? Because I did the same thing. I moved to Mexico for a couple of years, and I learned from reading comic books. I learned Spanish. So I want to hear about all that. So.
Yeah, El Hombre Arcaña.
Yes, that's exactly it.
Yeah. So not a lot of people know this. It's interesting. I had a conversation about it with Paul Levitz, the former president and editor-in-chief and publisher of DC Comics. Mm-hmm. And we talk about how it's just not known. People know about the DC implosion, and before then the DC explosion, and they know about the trials and tribulations of Marvel in the 90s. But in 1986, when DC hit the reset button and sort of wiped the canon clean, the continuity, and kind of republished, they also used the opportunity, and then they were a subsidiary of Warner Brothers only for a few years. They really used the opportunity to push in international markets and either directly or through licensing, usually through licensing, get comics translated and published in different countries. And one of those countries in 1985, 1986 was Israel. So I first came upon them in Hebrew. It was John Byrne's Man of Steel.
Oh, wow.
There was some Batman issues. This is before year one. So this was Jim Aparo and some Neil Adams stuff that was translated. And I remember being driven crazy because Hebrew goes right to left. It's a classical language. So aside, I was too young to catch on that the action was off, but Superman's S was flipped and it drove me nuts. Now today, digitally,
Hysterical.
It's not a hard thing to do, but back then they just flipped negatives. But because there was a limited supply, that led me to seek out, there was no market then. It was all used bookstores and magazine stores. I sought out more comics, and I was always a reader. And that sort of started my lifelong passion.
So it was all the DC line pretty much?
Yeah, it was mostly DC, although I love Marvel, and ultimately Cap is my favorite. And I remember my first Cap issue to this day. But DC, yeah. So I can speak English because of Superman, which is why you'll find me saying things like swell or great Scott.
I lived in Israel in the 80s also, and I only read the English comics. I didn't read the Hebrew ones though too. But so I should have done that the same thing, but I only read English, but I was reading Marvel. So, when did you move to the States? So what prompted that?
In 2004. So I'm a citizen now. Mm-hmm. And I'm closing up closing in on spending more than half my life in the States. I hatched in 1980. I moved here in 2004. You can do the math. And I came here for New York always felt like home. The first time I came here, I came on a trip with my parents when I was 6. And family legend is that I walked up to my parents after a couple of days and said, I'll live here when I grow up.
You moved directly to New York?
No, so at age 6, I came to New York on a trip.
Okay.
And after a couple of days in New York, I walked up to my parents and said, this is where I want to live when I grow up. And I've since given up on growing up, but this is where I live. This is home. I have 2 homes, no problem with that. And I came here for college, and then I stayed for grad school. And by that point, I had a green card. Then I ended up getting married and having, 2.5 kids in the suburbs with a white picket fence and all the cliches. And I'm living a pretty blissful life. So I'm pretty,
So
pretty,
you're out on
pretty
Long
excited
Island now,
about that.
right?
It's what?
You're out on Long Island.
Yes.
I know you can't tell from my accent, but I'm from New York also. But
Gently. People say, where is my accent from? I tell them England. That's why I sound like Hugh Grant. You want some promos? It's very good.
so when did you first start showing, like, I guess, an interest in writing, and more importantly, when did you first start realizing that you had a talent for it?
Assuming I have a talent to whatever extent I do. First grade.
Oh,
So
really?
I
Okay.
entered first grade fully literate. I was reading, shout out to my parents who got me Shakespeare for Kids and that kind of stuff. And
I
comics
had that.
definitely were helpful. By the time I started first grade, I was fairly literate in English too. And I just was more interested in writing stories and what I now know were essays in my notebooks than actually listening to the teachers. And I remember first grade in my notebook, I had a whole discussion with RoboCop and Rambo. This is the 80s, so kids were allowed to watch these movies. There was RoboCop and Rambo having a discussion with Captain America and Superman about the morality of killing villains. And that's not a normal thing for a first grader to. Now I understand it was an essay, but that's what I wrote about, and it sort of followed me. I wrote papers in high school, in college. My um, final paper, which won like the new school's top paper,
Oh,
whatever,
wow.
whatever, was about Mark Grunwald's Squadron Supreme graphic novel,
Yeah.
right? And in grad school, I wrote a paper which was titled "Is Superman Circumcised?" I like, you know,
Want to get to
um,
that for sure? Yeah.
provocative titles, right?
Right.
But that one was much more academic. It's not the book. It was really about the concept of heroism and the heroic figure in Judaism, from the Bible through mostly the Ashkenazi tradition to today,
Mhm.
compared to the Christian continental tradition. And those have similarities and differences. That's very academic and, Poindextery. But that got some press. And it, long story short, led to the book. And the book is really just an exploration of the history of comics
So,
using Superman as the paradigm from the Jewish perspective. But it's
yeah,
a
so
book for everybody.
let me talk about the book. Yeah, so right, it is Superman Circumcised, and just a great title. Okay, by the way, and we'll get to the documentary in a moment, but I want to start with this with Superman. So created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. Can you talk about them a little bit? And also, you have a good piece in the forward. I was looking when I was researching you. I saw that you wrote about this there as well, about the Jewish mythology integrated into the character. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, I could talk a lot about that.
Absolutely. Yes.
So the book is Superman Circumcised, the complete Jewish history of the world's greatest hero. Available everywhere. Fine books are sold. You can find it or order it from any bookstore. The It actually won. There's a humorous but very real literary award given in England for the oddest book title in the world called The
That's
Diagram
incredible.
Press.
That's incredible
And
to
I
me.
won when my book
Yes,
came out.
congrats, Mazel Tov. Yes.
And, and I'm proud of that, probably a lot more than I should be, but I am. Hundreds of people win the Pulitzer, but this one, just me. Uh, um, and as luck would have, the book was doing well. Touchwood, very grateful. The book was well received and has sold well even to that point. But as luck would have it, on that day that I won the Diagram Prize, nothing happened in the world. This was 2021. Nobody was tweeting crazy stuff from the White House. The Middle East was quiet. Just nothing happened. And I ended up landing on a front page of The Guardian, which is the biggest newspaper in England. And then my book just blew up, just
Really.
exploded into national sales and became a bestseller. And I'm very, very grateful. Pure luck. Um, Aside from that, I what I did is I'm not the first one to write about it.
Hmm.
But when I was reading other works, and this, the credit goes, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. Danny Fingeroth,
Yeah.
who wrote things like Superman on the Couch and Disguised as Clark Kent. Ari Kaplan, who wrote From Krakow to Krypton. Simca Weinstein, who wrote Up, Up and Oive, another excellent title. Um, and a few others. But what I thought was, comparing this to archaeology, they stumbled upon the tip of the pyramid and then moved on. And I came back and dug the whole thing up. That's sort of my metaphor because there's so much more. And with the before I came along, the focus was exclusively on the golden age of Superman, which is where the mythology was established. But there's so much more Jewish stuff that got integrated into the mythology in the 60s, in the 70s, under editors like Mort Weisinger and Julia Schwartz, and writers like Elliot S. Maggin, who I had the pleasure of interviewing, and he confirmed pretty much everything. Um, and I will give you examples.
Yeah, I'd love to hear that. Yes.
But it's really a ton of stuff. Uh, it really is a Jewish story, and writers, and it's not conspiratorial. People borrow, they write what they know, they borrow from their kind of cultural orbit, um, and they borrowed a lot from Judaism. Whether it's Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, or Jack Kirby and Joe Simon, or Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, doesn't matter. They all borrowed Jewish elements.
Mhm.
And when you look at comics from that perspective, you can't stop seeing it. It's just again and again and again and again and again. There's so much. So I thought somebody should write a book, and I did.
So, not that this has, can you just talk about a little bit, because is all that true? Like, the Samson and all that things, and is that was integrated, that was consciously done to put that in?
So Samson is actually, that's a great question, because Samson is a good example in that it's been compared as conjecture. Oh, he's kind of like Samson. Oh, he's on the cover of Superman #4. He topples pillars. It's sort of like Samson
Right.
in the Temple of the Philistines. But it was all conjecture, and there have actually been a few people who pushed back on it. Except that Jerry Siegel wrote a memoir that never got published and got lost. And it was discovered by Larry Ty in 2011 when he was researching, or 2011 as the book came out, when he was researching his book, Superman, The High-Flying History of America's Favorite Hero, which is just a general biography of the character.
Mhm.
And that typed manuscript ended up at the Columbia Special Collections Library. So I
Wow.
went up there and I scanned the whole thing
Hmm.
and I started reading it. And I was clutching my hair going, Great Scott, how come nobody has used this for this perspective? It's a treasure trove. And one of the things, and Jerry Siegel is very raw in it. He really kind of confesses to, I swiped this, I stole this was a bad idea, this was a great idea, I fought with Joe. There's a lot of really cool stuff in it. And one of the things he says is that Moses was a conscious and deliberate, a strong influence on the
Mhm.
creation of Superman, that this cover of Superman #4 was deliberate, that he referred to Superman in the early comics as the modern Samson, a new Samson and that kind of stuff. Um, and that Samson, don't forget, he was known for his super strength, right? But he was
Right.
also a judge. He fought in the name of truth and justice. So there's a lot there. And
Well,
Siegel talks about how he's inspired by the Golem in creating this
right.
indestructible, indefatigable champion of the oppressed, about the plight of Jews by Nazis in Europe and by anti-Semitism in America. It's all there. It's all there.
Well, when you look at the Samson perspective, it just makes so much sense. The super strong being with the weakness, the one weakness that if something happens to it. So it's just like, and it never occurred to me before I was reading, what you wrote this week. And it's like, oh my gosh, yes, it's so obvious.
Thank you. That's the biggest compliment. People say, I never thought about it, but now that I read what you wrote, I cannot see it. That's
Right.
my
It's just so blatant. Okay, just you said you read all the biography, the autobiography there too. So not that it has anything to do with being Jewish, but can you just talk a little? I mean, they were really kind of screwed over, Siegel and Schuster by DC at some point. Yes and no, but yes, but in the long
right.
run, yes. So
It's the cardinal sin. It's the original sin of the industry. Um, they it's not quite as simple and as black and white as the romantic story tells it, because nothing ever is, right? They weren't these two little itty bitty kids who had no idea what they were
right,
doing, and the publishers were sort of rubbing their fingers, steepling their fingers like villains, and
right,
twirling their mustache. We're
yeah.
gonna steal. It's not that at all. Not to defend the publishers in the slightest, but it's not that. Siegel and Schuster invented Superman. The idea had an evolution, but the version we know in 1934. And until 1938, for 4 years, they couldn't sell it.
Hmm.
They pitched him to every single newspaper syndicate in the United States, every single one, and they all turned them down. They said the idea is too gimmicky, it's too silly, it doesn't have lasting power. And Siegel kept all of them. They're in the papers. I read through all of the ones that he
Wow,
kept.
that's
But my
incredible.
favorite was from King Feature Syndicate is the idea is too fantastical, kids would never relate. Now, you can't make that stuff up, right?
Yes.
But think of 1934 is only when the comic book medium, the magazine, was invented. Then you just had strips of newspapers or pulp magazines. They didn't think to combine them until then. And there's nothing like superheroes. Superman is the first superhero
Right.
proper. You had like federal men, G-men, and scuba divers, and soldiers of fortune, and swashbucklers. That's it. Tarzan was like the craziest thing in Flash Gordon.
Hmm.
And they come up with an idea of an alien who looks human, who wears long johns and a cape. Again, this all came from, they brought it into the mythology. He has a secret identity and nobody can tell who he is, and he can fly through the air and bullets bounce off his skin, and all that kind of stuff. It's a Michigan idea. Nobody thought that would do well. And even when DC did finally decide, they had series called Action Comics. Back then, all the comic books were anthologies. Superman #1, June 1939, is the first ever comic to feature one character. So DC had a new anthology. Back then it was National Periodical Publications, called Action Comics, and they were 13 pages short, and the printer was already booked. They had to go to print. They had nothing to put in, so they went back to the rejected pile. They had rejected Superman. It's called the slush pile.
Incredible.
Pulled out something that was the right length, slapped it in there.
Amazing.
Reportedly, when Harry Donenfeld, one of the two publishers, Harry Donenfeld and Jack Leibowitz, saw the cover with Superman on it, he was inflamed that they chose that stupid image on the cover. He thought that it would turn kids away, which is why Superman didn't show up for another 7 months on the covers. And the rest is history, as they say. And what happened when Siegel and Schuster finally sold the character, nobody thought of this as valuable IP. Nobody thought we would be having conversations about it or that I would be curating museum exhibits about it. Not at all. It was junk. It was fast food, and
almost 90 years later, we're still like
right. The custom back then was when you sold your story, you sold the rights. And Siegel and Schuster got paid $10 a page, 13 pages, $130, which is about just under $3,000 by today's standards, which is pretty respectable. They're at this point 18 years old, which back in 1938 meant you were a man. You're a grown up, young. You're a man. You're no longer a kid. Depression era. The families are struggling. They're both very poor, so they signed over the rights, and things deteriorated. At first they were hired. They got a contract. They got a contract for 10 years. They were paid very, very well. They were making millions by today's standards. And to their detriment, they also squandered a lot of money, especially Siegel. They saved nothing, invested nothing, just lived a life. But what happened is, as Superman became a huge success, Donald and Leibowitz started lying about how successful he was, started doing creative book accounting, putting all their expenses on the Superman title to show lower net profits, which is what Martin Goodman did with Captain America to Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. And things boiled over, and it's a long story, and it's all in the book, step by step. I went over the entire legal history. It's the longest IP litigation in world history.
Wow.
Started from 1947 all the way to 2016, settled with the heirs. That's a very long series of lawsuits. But I really went through all the court papers and managed to summarize them in what I think is easy to understand and simple. But the short story is that the relationship soured, and it just became more and more combative. And eventually they were fired and lived a life of poverty until the 70s, which is really tragic.
It really is. Yeah. I read a little bit about this story for years ago, and it's just terrible with what happened with them. So your book came out. You mentioned it before that it just exploded when it came out. So how off guard were you caught with this?
Not that much. And I know it sounds weird, like, ego. This guy, what kind of ego does he have that he expects? It's not about me. It's about the topic. It was so interesting, and so little has been written about it, and so much has not been discovered. When I was researching, I had to stop and do lateral research to make sure it really is the first time anybody's writing about this stuff. That I thought would be fascinating, and I couldn't understand why would anybody with either interest in comic book history or Superman or Jewish culture not want to know this stuff.
Right.
So, I know it sounds very kind of but it didn't surprise me because I thought it was a really cool idea, a really cool topic. But the fact that it became what it became was I did not expect that, especially given that it came out at peak COVID and lockdown and all that kind of stuff. And I'm very, very grateful because even if you're the most talented and disciplined creator in the world, half of everything is luck. So I've been very lucky.
Yeah, no, but I mean, but you could be confident. I mean, I'm an author too, and we all send out with the best intentions, but we don't all get like, wow, this is really like exploding. So that's like, that's fantastic. And the title, you said it won the audience. Did you have to submit that, or was that just someone did that for you? Did you just have to
It's
enter
funny,
that?
I submitted it.
You did submit it, okay.
The weird thing is that my publisher, McFarland, which to their great credit, they kind of argued with me a little bit on the subtitle, but they never had a problem with it. They understood the title was meant to be provocative and also kind of funny to signal that it's, you can enjoy this book. It's not homework. You can read on a beach. It's not something you have to kind of, but we did get blowback. There were a couple of TV stations that refused to report on it. I was interviewed on Fox News and they only read the subtitle. They couldn't read the actual title. I got what today we call canceled. That term came a couple of years later. I got canceled by a bunch of like places. This regardless of Jewish, just because of the title.
Right.
And my favorite is that anti-circumcision activists came after me, and they review bombed me on Amazon, and I had to do a whole thing explaining to people the book is not literally about Superman circumcision. There's 96 images in the book. I promise you, they're all
None of them are circumcisions. That's fantastic. I think it's fantastic that the activists for anti-circumcision actually did that. That's a better story than having it not.
Yeah. There was a lot of fun stuff with it.
So I want to talk about the documentary because that's why I first, started finding out all about you. As I saw the documentary thing going, all the advertised all over. So it seems like the next logical thing, right? Jewce. So although growing up, that was one of the things that I was proud of. The amount of Jews in the foundation of comics. I always knew about that. I'd always read about that. So how did the idea for the documentary come about? It started with a museum exhibit?
Yeah, I mean, before then there was a middle step that I was invited by CNN to write an article based on my book for the website, and it was very well received. And then they made me a regular contributor.
Mm-hmm.
So until August, I was writing monthly, about different things, not necessarily comic books, not necessarily Superman, although often about that. I did some pieces I'm very proud of, and CNN is huge. You write an article, it's like 20 million readers. It's a great reach. But then in August, I don't know if you've been following media news, but CNN is owned by Warner Brothers Discovery. They're doing layoffs. So it's from me all the way up to the editor-in-chief of the website. We all just got let go, like 1,300 people. Yeah, it's life. So now when you read articles online, just know it's, most of it is AI-driven and supervised by like a 22-year-old. That's just the news now. All very sad.
Terrible, yeah.
I always say, Superman, the fact that he can comb over his hair, put on glasses, and nobody recognizes him, I'll buy. The fact that he's from a whole different planet but looks exactly like a human Caucasian hunk, I'll buy. The fact he can fly, I'll buy. But he works for a financially viable print newspaper. That's why I draw the line.
True. Yes.
But no. So I did CNN, and that did well. And then Dr. Miriam Mora, who was the director of academics at the Center for Jewish History, which is a Smithsonian affiliate archive and museum in New York City. It's very kind of august institution, decided, like all museums and all academic institutions, are trying to get young people because old donors tend to die. That's just the nature of,
Mm-hmm.
And they were looking for something fun, and she said comics, and they started putting it together. And she reached out to Danny Fingeroth, a legend in the field. If you don't know who he is, Google him. And not you, of course, but
Yes, I understand.
And me, and we co-curated an exhibit together, which I'm very proud of, called Jewce, the Jewish Comics Experience. The exhibit had also like a Jewish Comic-Con day, which was the most attended single-day event of the history of the center. So it all went very well.
Amazing.
And then we got approached by JLTV, Jewish Life Television, which is a cable channel that you can watch on Amazon Prime. Just speak it into your stick, and it'll pop up. If we wanted to film it and we got Turnkey Pictures, and the owner, who's also a director, Tony Kim, who's one of those like real deal genius directors. You know, he has a vision and he comes in and he comes up with ideas that you. Anyway, we really created something that is putting on the hat as a comic book fan, not as the guy who was involved,
Sure.
is spectacular. I mean, it's so much fun. It's a short documentary. It's a TV special. It's 23 minutes long without the commercials, but there are over 400 images and video clips in it. It's a cut every 3.5 seconds.
Well,
Visually rich it is. And we did some additional research beyond the exhibit, but it loosely tells the stories of the exhibit, using it as a framework. But it's all new and original. And now we're doing the festival circuit.
that's fantastic. No, I'm hoping that it comes around here to where I am, that in Florida. So, just as someone who's so interested in this, and you've written about this too, how did Jews, which, for people who don't follow it, how did Jews become so entrenched in the comic book field to begin with?
They didn't get entrenched in the comic book field. They
created it, yes,
because they had no other opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very similar origin story to Hollywood, an industry of our own, but it's two industries separated at birth. It's the 1930s. It's the Great Depression. It really started in the 20s with the popes. It's the Great Depression. There's not, 1 in 4 Americans is unemployed. 1 in 25 is homeless. I think the average income dropped by 40% for those who were lucky enough to be employed. Things were bad. And on top of that, anti-Semitism was perfectly acceptable, even more than it is today. So respectable industries, book publishing, glossy, nice magazine publishing, they ad agencies, certainly waspy strongholds. No Jews need apply, or they had quotas. But what was sort of available is all the, the schmata business, the garment industry. So all these kind of, to be nice, I'll call it entrepreneurial businesses where you can turn a quick buck is what appealed to people with no prospects. All these immigrants and children of immigrants living in New York and the South Bronx and in the Lower East Side and a little bit in Brooklyn. They started kind of putting things together, and they published pulps because it was considered the lowest of the lowest of the low. Sort of things that, illiterate teenagers would read. It really took a while to get to that kind of, and even that there was a hierarchy. There was the Cadillacs of those things, nice pulps, but that's not the ones that Jews were allowed in. And then at some point, a unemployed school teacher from the Bronx called MC Gaines, Maxwell Ginsburg, as legend has it, the romantic telling of the story, which is probably close to true, is he had to move in with his family back with his mom in the Bronx. He was cleaning the attic one day, mostly to avoid his mom from nagging him about finding a job. And he had kept as a kid all the newspaper strips and Sunday pages from the newspapers, and he found himself reading them, enjoying them. And he had this light bulb moment where if he could license the old strips on the newspaper and print them as a magazine, put like a 10-cent cover sticker on it, kids would part with their allowance, with their change. And the first ones weren't even sold or given away as Procter & Gamble promotional items.
Got to hook them first, right?
But it escalated quickly, as they say, and it became a huge industry. And again, it was considered very raffish, very lowbrow, very here today, gone tomorrow, sort of offshoot of the pulps, this junk food. Total junk food fad. And so Jews came and they started, if you could hold a pencil and draw something more than a stick figure, you're an artist. If you could put together a sentence without too many misspells, you're a writer. And you start bringing your cousin and your neighbor and your friend from school, and one thing led to the next.
It's fantastic. So one of the things that I read, which struck me because the personal nature of it, I guess, was how Siegel and Schuster created that Superman Clark Kent dynamic because of how they felt. And that's how I felt reading Spider-Man as a kid. It made me identify with him. As a normal person, you're the shy, meek individual. But once the mask goes on, you can let your true nature come out. And so I feel it as a writer now a little bit. And I think it's a great example of Jews in the industry in general and why they created superheroes. You have the ones being picked on as by society, and then who created the superheroes that weren't them. There was something else. So what are your thoughts on that as a whole?
Spider-Man is almost like the opposite of Superman because he really is Clark Kent. That's his real personality. The mask comes on. Superman, he's disguised as Clark Kent. Superman is the real guy. And I talk a lot about that in the book and how we're actually giving the character short shrift by looking at it as a binary. He really has kind of these three aspects to his identity, and the constant struggle of acculturation or assimilation is really the interesting part of the character. It's the process. It's not the final answer. And Spider-Man also, he's Silver Age. So he's the second generation of heroes, but in a very real way represents the second generation of American-born Jews who are a lot more comfortable in their own skin, but still have their anxieties. And, the fact that Peter Parker is secretly Jewish, canonically not, but really is maybe the most well-known secret in the comic book industry. I mean, he says "oi" so many times in his comics. A lot of other, he talks about Manischewitz, complains about being tired from Shavuos, and says his tuchus aches. The kid is Jewish. But one of the things I like to point out is think about Spider-Man. His power to climb things and swing from things is really only effective in Midtown Manhattan, and that's as Jewish of a metaphor as it gets. Put him in Iowa and he's got nothing.
Right. Yes.
So that to me is a very powerful metaphor. But yeah, again, go back to the 30s, 40s, being the idea of identity politics, being proud of what you are, who you are, where you come from, your culture, that was not a thing. Everybody strived to put on their fedora and assimilate into the waspy norm. That was the thing. There wasn't even a question about it. So, you get Kal El. El in Hebrew means God. Yeah. It's the suffix of it's a theophoric suffix of all the names of the prophets and angels. Daniel, Michael, it's Michael, Gabriel, et cetera, et cetera. He comes up with this Hebraic name from elsewhere, from the old world, the old country, and he anglicizes his name to Clark Kent, which sounds like the name equivalent of Wonder Bread, right? So waspy and American. And he puts his talis in his costume, in his outfit, and he puts on the fedora and he assimilates. And he starts behaving, and that was very much a metaphor, and very much, it's not even a metaphor. It's Siegel and Schuster's suit in fiction. If you'd have to put on an astronaut suit to walk out your space shuttle into space, that's what they did to walk into their fantasy world. He was them and they were him. And they talk about it in interviews, and Siegel in his memoir talks about it at length, how he acted out all of his fantasies and wishes and fears and neuroses through Clark Kent and Superman, and that was him in fiction.
So I'm very curious now, because you're well versed on the industry as a whole. Where do you think the industry stands today? Because like so many branches of the arts, fields that were started by Jews have embraced all aspects of anti-Semitism a lot. So where do you feel the comic is now? Because I look at certain things like Sabra, the Israeli superhero, is like, he gets flack just from being. I look at the Penguin on the Harley Quinn comic, all these anti-Semitic tropes, and put in. So where do you think that where the industry stands now?
Yeah, that was bad. I wrote about the Penguin in Harley Quinn for the forward in a piece about the
I didn't see that. I'm gonna have to look at that now. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's also a anti-Semitic controversy about the Penguin in Batman Returns, which actually dismiss. I don't think there's anything to it. Mm-hmm. But the version of the Penguin in Harley Quinn, particularly the Bar Mitzvah episode, is bad.
Well, there's no disguising the one in Harley Quinn. It's there.
Yeah. And it didn't help. There's a character from the comics of Harley Quinn called Cyborgman. Got a cyborg man, and he's like her cyborg landlord. And the co-creator, who's not Jewish, in a tweet that he since deleted, but still is around online, described him as half Jewish, half Jew, half man. Now you say, "Oh, he didn't mean anything by it." Just replace Jew with black or gay.
Right. Exactly.
Just imagine somebody saying, "Oh, half black, half human."
Yeah.
That's bad. That's really bad. So, but again, anti-Semitism, especially if you can make the excuse that it's not or not intended, gets a free pass in a way that no other bigotry does, completely in all the industries. I have to give so I'll say about comics, on one hand, I give them credit. You don't have as many like Hollywood airheads tweeting nonsense they have no idea about, as Ricky Gervais said, if Hamas and ISIS started a TV station tomorrow, half these people would call their agents to get them a gig. They don't know anything about anything, so they should keep their opinions to themselves. But you don't see that much in comic books. You don't see all these creators in comic books tweeting about, blah, 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 blah. So credit to the industry.
You see some. I will say you do see some. Okay. But...
No, I'm not saying.
Yeah.
That's why I said I qualify.
Okay.
Listen, people are allowed to their opinions, to be clear. Social political criticism, let's say of Israel or any kind of political social commentary on Jewish culture is not the same as anti-Semitism. but anti-Semitism disguises itself as that.
Hmm.
And if you're honest about it, it's not hard to tell the difference. It's just not. You just take the same equation, replace Jew
Right.
with black, gay, woman, whatever,
Everything.
what have you.
Right.
You can tell. It's not hard. What I will say that I do not give the comic book industry credit for and does bother me is that they have ignored anti-Semitism, especially Marvel, which has always been the world outside your window.
Mhm.
They've had so much of what's going on in the world in the past decade or so. From 9/11 onwards, they've been much more engaged with reality compared to the 80s and 90s. And they've addressed the rise in misogynism during Me Too and that kind of
Mhm.
stuff. They've addressed the rise in populism and fascism and war, etc. So it's all addressed, and racism, of course. It's all addressed in the comics, oftentimes through the X-Men comics, which tend to be a bit more. Um, but the tidal wave of anti-Semitism, Jews are 2.4% of the American population, but almost 70% of all hate crimes
Right.
are against Jews. That's more than all of the groups combined by a margin. That's how insane that is.
Mhm.
Nothing, tumbleweeds.
Yep.
Um, because it's sensitive and political to address the fact that it's open season on Jews. Not to go too dark. I want this to be a happy podcast, but uh, I am disappointed that these things have been, by and large, ignored by the comic book industry.
I'm right there with you with this. Yes, and that. So I see it in publishing all the time as well. The same exact thing. So you mentioned Spider-Man before, and I agree. There is no more Jewish hero than Spider-Man. I mean, you look at him, everything's this guy's Jewish. Doesn't matter what anyone could say or anything like that. The sense of humor, the type of jokes, everything is Jewish. So, are there any other heroes that you feel like this is really Jewish? And I know the Thing is supposed to be in Fantastic Four, but is anyone else that you just see?
Well, Ben Grimm is
Right.
canonically Jewish. Danny Fingeroth and I have a debate over it. He argues that Grimm was always more Irish because that's kind of James Cagney. James Cagney was Jack Kirby's kind of hero, and he kind of modeled himself after him a little bit, and part of why he called himself Kirby. But the Thing was always Jack Kirby. Benjamin was Jack's father, and Jacob is Jack. Benjamin, Yancey Street is Delancey Street where he grew up, et cetera, et cetera. The street gang background, the service in the army, the cigar. I recently interviewed for CNN actually his son Neil Kirby,
Oh, wow, that's fantastic.
who confirmed that the Thing is absolutely my father Jack. Just stick a cigar in his mouth and you're good. The eyebrow, the whole thing, absolutely no question. So I think he was always meant to be Jewish, and Reed Richards was always, to an extent, Stan Lee. And depending on who was writing it, it could either be how Stan would like to think of himself versus how Jack would like to poke fun at him. Keep in mind that early on they got along a lot better than later on.
Right.
And later on they got along much better than in the middle. So Jack Kirby is my absolute favorite comic book artist in history, but
I had a lot of people say that.
Yeah, I'm not of the school of thought that he created at a minimum 100% of everything. That's credit where credit is due. There's plenty to go around, but there are other characters that are quoted Jewish or are Jewish. The two surprising ones that I will share with you, you must be wondering, and I'm glad you asked, and I'll tell you. Aside from the X-Men. Okay, let's go with the X-Men, actually.
Okay.
So it's a different race of humanity that's more evolved, but humanity fears and hates them, and they are persecuted for what they are. Some of them can pass for humans, some of them are clearly mutants, and they find refuge in a private school in New York where they learn how to use the gifts of their heritage. These are a bunch of Jews in the yeshiva. Charles Xavier is a rabbi. Come on, he's the first of that kind of leader. But you look at other characters, Green Lantern. So Green Lantern is originally modeled after Paul Newman, Jewish actor. Same year as Exodus, the big movie where he played, the big Jewish hero. And the Guardians of the Universe, not to be confused with Guardians of the Galaxy, were originally modeled after David Ben Gurion, the first prime minister of the state of Israel.
I didn't know.
Look at the original comics, it's crazy. But even more interesting than that, aside from the fact that light and life having very strong connotations in Jewish mysticism, that's the whole of Kabbalah is basically rooted in that. The original number of Green Lanterns is 3,600, right? Yes, you say yes.
Yes,
The original number of Green Lanterns is 3,600. They never explained it. There's never an interview with an explanation on it. There's never like a Comic-Con kind of talk, panel. They never explained it. But in the Talmud, there's a story about the 36 righteous men whose identity is secret and who fight the forces of
That's
evil with
fantastic.
light. Come on,
That's fantastic. That's
coincidence?
great.
So there's a lot of that kind of stuff.
Now I have homework to do after. I have to go look this up. So I have to ask you, okay, so what are you working on next?
So right now we're focused on the documentary, which I co-produced with Tony Kim of Turnkey Pictures, and the executive producers and interviewees include Dr. Mora and Danny Fingeroth. So we're sort of like the Jewce crew. So we're focused on that documentary, which you can find the trailer online and that kind of stuff. Festival season just started, so we're doing the festival circuit, and we've been lucky. We've been accepted to a few nice festivals, and we're doing that kind of stuff. We're hoping to have a show at Comic-Con. We'll see how that goes at San Diego. We had one in New York.
Any South Florida by any chance?
Well, it depends. Listen, if you know somebody at any
I'll have to take a look.
Florida, you make the connection. We'll come. If you build it, we will come.
Absolutely.
But for now, no, we don't. And there's a Miami Film Festival, and I think we submitted, but I don't know. So we have a whole thing going on. So that's the one thing. And the other thing, and this is a nice little surprise, is that I actually was hired to work on the marketing campaign for the Superman movie.
Oh, wow.
On the upcoming Superman movie. And so I can't say much. There's an NDA that's just insane. And if I say something, I'll be snipered out in a second.
You'll get on James Gunn's bad side.
Right. He hired Deathstroke to take me out. But
oh, that's fantastic. Oh, I look forward to that. That'll be great. And how can people follow you on social media?
So you can find me at royschwartz.com. I have a newsletter and all that, although the website is a little bit outdated, but still, I'm there. And I am real Roy Schwartz. Don't fall for any of the fake ones. Real Roy Schwartz on Facebook, Instagram, and X.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. It's been an absolute pleasure. I love all the things that I've seen with you. So, and I appreciate you saying yes, right away when I asked to do this.
Thank you. Pleasure being here.
And anytime you want to come back, you're more than welcome. I'll definitely ask you when the Superman movie comes out.
Yes. Well, yeah. Once it comes out, I can tell you more stories. Right now,
that's what I want to hear. Fantastic. Well, again, this has been The Jewish Lens. I'm Jonathan Rosen. And again, a very special thanks to Roy Schwartz. And please like, comment, and subscribe.
Thanks for tuning in to The Jewish Lens, where all items used was strictly kosher.